The hidden genius behind God's delays. There's a moment that haunts most believers. You're on your knees, prayers whispered into the silence, watching someone else get the job you prayed for, the relationship you longed for, the breakthrough you desperately needed, and you're left with one burning question. God, where are you? Here's what nobody tells you about that moment. What feels like divine abandonment might actually be divine precision. What if I told you that the same God who orchestrated the entire universe down to the molecular level hasn't suddenly become careless with your life? What if those delays aren't denials at all, but something far more intentional? Today, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood aspects of faith, the paradox of waiting. And by the end of this, you'll never look at a closed door the same way again. The invisible strategy. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine standing in front of a massive jigsaw puzzle, but you can only see 3 pieces at a time. You're desperately trying to force pieces together that clearly don't fit, getting frustrated, wondering why the picture isn't coming together. Meanwhile, someone stands above with a view of the entire completed image, knowing exactly which piece needs to go where and when. That's the difference between your timeline and God's. But here's where it gets interesting. Recent studies in behavioral psychology have shown that humans are notoriously bad at delayed gratification. We want what we want now. The famous Stanford marshmallow experiment from 1972 revealed that children who could resist immediate rewards for greater future benefits showed better life outcomes decades later. But here's the twist. It wasn't just about willpower. It was about trust in the promise. When we're stuck in what feels like divine delay, we're not seeing the orchestration happening behind the scenes. Think about Joseph in the Bible, sold into slavery by his brothers at 17, falsely accused and thrown into prison, forgotten by people he helped. 13 years. 13 years of what looked like one cosmic mistake after another. But here's what's remarkable. Every single setback was actually setting him up. The slavery taught him Egyptian culture. The false accusation built his integrity. The prison connected him to Pharaoh's officials. When famine struck, Joseph wasn't just ready, he was the only person on earth positioned perfectly to save entire nations, including his own family. If any piece had been rushed, the entire rescue operation would have collapsed. The refining fire. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. When you're in the waiting room of life, it doesn't feel like strategic positioning. It feels like punishment. It feels personal. You watch your friends get married while you're still single. You see colleagues get promoted while you're passed over. You witness others' prayers answered seemingly overnight while yours echo in empty spaces. But consider this perspective shift. What if God loves you too much to give you something you're not ready to steward? There's a fascinating principle in metallurgy called work hardening. When metal is repeatedly stressed and reformed, it doesn't become weaker, it becomes significantly stronger. The process looks destructive from the outside, but it's actually increasing the material's durability at a molecular level. The waiting isn't breaking you down, it's building you up in ways you can't yet measure. Abraham waited 25 years for Isaac. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before leading the Exodus. David was anointed king as a teenager but didn't take the throne until his 30s. In every case, the delay wasn't arbitrary, it was preparation for a responsibility that would have crushed them if it came earlier. Think about it practically. If you received your dream job without first developing patience, how would you handle difficult employees? If you got married before learning to love yourself, how would you love someone else healthily? If you became wealthy before understanding generosity, what kind of steward would you be? The delay is developing character that matches the calling. And that's not punishment, that's mercy. The hidden synchronization. Here's where it gets mind-blowing. Your delay isn't just about you. Right now, there are dozens, Maybe hundreds of other pieces moving across the chessboard of your life. People you haven't met yet are being prepared to enter your story at exactly the right moment. Opportunities are being cultivated in ways you can't see. Resources are being aligned. Circumstances are shifting. Research from MIT's Operations Management Department shows that in complex systems like supply chains or air traffic control, rushing one element actually creates delays and failures throughout the entire system. Timing isn't just important, it's everything. When one piece moves prematurely, it creates a cascade of problems that are harder to fix than if everything had stayed in its proper sequence. Your life is infinitely more complex than any supply chain. Consider Ruth, a widow from Moab with no prospects, no security, and no reason to hope. She's gleaning in fields just to survive. But watch the invisible orchestration. She happens to glean in Boaz's field. Boaz happens to notice her. He happens to be a kinsman redeemer. Another relative happens to decline the responsibility. Each coincidence is actually divine synchronization. But here's the critical detail most people miss. The timing mattered. If Ruth had met Boaz during harvest season the previous year, he might have been too busy to notice. If she'd arrived after harvest, there would be no reason for her to be in his field. The timing wasn't just good, it was surgically precise. And that's what's happening in your waiting. God isn't just preparing you. He's synchronizing an entire network of people, circumstances, and opportunities that will converge at exactly the right moment. The posture of waiting. So, how do you actually live in this tension between trust and frustration? First, understand that active waiting looks nothing like passive resignation. When Nehemiah heard Jerusalem's walls were destroyed, he didn't just pray, he wept, fasted, and then made a plan. When the king finally asked what he needed, Nehemiah had already calculated materials, mapped routes, and identified resources. The waiting wasn't wasted, it was weaponized. Prayer during delay isn't about convincing God to change his timeline, it's about aligning your heart with his rhythm. It's the difference between demanding an answer and developing intimacy. Some of the deepest relationships with God are forged not when he's giving us what we want, but when we're learning to want what he's giving himself. Practically, this means asking different questions. Not when will this happen, but what are you teaching me right now? Not why is this taking so long, but who are you shaping me to become? Not how much longer, but how can I grow deeper? Surrender isn't weakness, it's strategic positioning. When you release your white-knuckle grip on your own timeline, you free your hands to receive what God's been trying to place in them all along. The masterpiece unveiled. Let me leave you with this final thought. Michelangelo spent 4 years painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. 4 years on his back, paint dripping in his eyes, body aching, creating what many consider the greatest artistic achievement in human history. Now imagine if, 2 years in, someone had demanded he finish immediately. Imagine if they'd said, "Just get it done, we're tired of waiting." The masterpiece would have been destroyed by the demand for speed. Your life is God's masterpiece. Every delay is another brushstroke. Every closed door is creating contrast. Every not yet is adding depth and dimension to something so beautiful that when it's finally revealed, you won't remember the waiting, you'll only see the wonder. The same God who didn't rush creation, who took his time forming mountains and designing DNA, isn't rushing with you. Not because he doesn't care, but because he cares too much to give you anything less than his best at exactly the right time. So the next time you're tempted to believe the delay is denial, remember, God's delays aren't about making you wait. They're about making you ready. And when everything finally aligns, when the pieces you couldn't see suddenly click into place, you'll realize that the waiting wasn't wasted. It was part of the wonder all along. The question isn't whether God's timing is right. The question is, Are you willing to trust the artist while the masterpiece is still in progress?